Today we're going to solve quadratic equations by completing the square. This is a method which will lead us to deriving the quadratic formula. Let's take the initial simple quadratic equation where a, the initial coefficient, is 1. So we have x squared plus bx plus c equals 0. How do we solve an equation like that using this method called completing the square? So the idea is we're going to be using the root property in this method, but we have to get to a point where we can use that square root property. So what we want to have is a square on the left side and something else on the right side. Here we have x squared plus 6x plus 3 equals 0. What do we do first? Well, the first thing we're going to have to do is move the 3 over to the other side. So I have x squared plus 6x equals negative 3. We subtracted 3 from both sides. So now completing the square means we want to make this on the left side a perfect square trinomial. And the way to do that is we take half of this number next to the x and square it. So half of 6, so in your head you're thinking, well, 6 divided by 2, that's 3. Half of 6 is 3, and then 3 squared, that's 9. So that's the number we want, 9. And we're going to just add 9 to the left side here. So we add 9. And what that means, because we have an equation, is we have to add 9 to the right side. So on the left side we have x squared plus 6x plus 9 and equals negative 3 plus 9. Well, we could add the right side. Negative 3 plus 9 is 6. So now we have to take the left side. This is a trinomial which we can factor. This is actually a perfect square trinomial. X squared plus 6x plus 9 can be factored into x plus 3 times x plus 3. You want to verify this by falling this back out. So we factored into x plus 3 times x plus 3, which in fact is x plus 3 squared. And now we can use the square root property. The square root property says, well, I can square root both sides. And what I end up with is x plus 3 equals plus or minus the square root of 6. And remember, we want x, so we subtract 3 from both sides. And so you find your solution, subtracting 3 from both sides, is x equals negative 3 plus or minus root 6. Sometimes we want to put the root on the back end of our solution. So we have negative 3 plus or minus root 6. And really these are two solutions. X equals negative 3 plus root 6. And x equals negative 3 minus root 6. And remember, you should always check your solutions in your original equations. Check your solutions in your original equations to make sure that they work out. Now what happens when you have an a which is other than 1? We have ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. A is not 1 now, is a number other than 1. And we want to solve this equation by completing the square. What do you do then? Well, you make it 1. And how do you do that? Let's take an example to see. I have this equation 4x squared minus 8x minus 5 equals 0. So I have a 4 in front of my x squared. I don't want a 4 there, I want a 1. So I could use this method of completing the square. So what do? I divide everything by this lead coefficient. I divide everything by 4. So I divide everything, both left and right, by 4. So what are we going to end up with? Well, 4 divided by 4 is 1. So I'm going to have an x squared minus 8 divided by 4 is 2. So I have a 2x minus 5 divided by 4 is 5/4. We'll leave that as a fraction. And on the right side, we have 0 divided by 4 is 0. And now we're ready to complete the square. So what are the steps in completing the square? The first thing is we move this constant term, which is a negative 5/4, to the right side. In other words, I'm going to add it to both sides to get x squared minus 2x equals 5/4. Then the second step is we're going to take half of this number that's next to the x and square it. Well, half of negative 2 is negative 1. I square negative 1, I get 1. So 1 is what we want to add to both sides. Remember, I take half of this negative 2, which is 1, negative 1, square negative 1, we get 1. So I'm adding that number, 1, to both sides. Finally, on the left side, we factor this left side into a perfect square trinomial. X squared minus 2x plus 1 can be factored into x minus 1 squared. And 5 fourths plus 1, well 5 fourths plus 4 fourths is 9 fourths. Now we can use the square root property. The square root property says you can square root both sides, and the right side is going to be plus or minus that square root. So the square root of x minus 1 squared is x minus 1. The square root of 9 fourths, well, the square root of 9 is 3, and the square root of 4 is 2. So we're going to get 3 halves plus or minus. And finally, I'm going to add 1 to both sides. So my answer is going to be x equal plus or minus 3 halves plus 1, because I add 1 to both sides. And we can actually work this out. X equals, let's say we're looking at plus 3 halves. 3 halves plus 1. 3 halves plus 1 is going to be 3 halves plus 2 halves. That's 5 halves. And my other solution is going to be, well, let's say we're looking at negative 3 halves. Negative 3 halves plus 1. Negative 3 halves plus 2 halves is negative a half. So those are my two solutions. And always remember to check these solutions back into your original equation to make sure that these two numbers work out for x to make that equation valid.